So Steve Bannon was found guilty of contempt of Congress, and he could be facing jail time. But is this really the justice we've been waiting for? Let's talk about it in today's video. Hi, I'm Mike Greiner. I'm a lifelong Democratic activist who's concerned about the direction our country is taking. I'm also a lawyer and an academic, and I'm here to help you stand up to the BS of the MAGA crowd. So Steve Bannon is found guilty of contempt of Congress. Hooray, right? I must say, though, I find myself somewhat nonplussed. Yes, it is true that shortly before the trial, Bannon suddenly wanted to cooperate with Congress, thinking that somehow this would stop him from facing these charges. He also went to the judge and asked for the trial to be delayed, hoping once again that he could somehow find some way to weasel out from these charges. The judge, of course, said no. And lastly, Bannon's attorneys promised to mount an aggressive defense, somehow justifying his decision not to comply with a subpoena from Congress to testify. But once the trial happened, it turned out there were only two witnesses, both of them brought by the government, both of them essentially to say, hey, he got a subpoena, here's the subpoena, he received it, he didn't testify. That was all that was needed. Bannon's attorneys did try to somehow undermine that testimony in cross-examination, but at a certain point here, he received a subpoena, he had the opportunity to respond to it, he didn't. It's pretty clear at that point. I guess it's not surprising that the jury only took 3 hours to come back finding him guilty. Now, all of us are probably feeling pretty good right now, seeing this jerk getting some of the just desserts, right? But if you think about it, it's kind of unsatisfying in a lot of ways. I mean, he could face up to a $100,000 fine and a year in jail, but this is still a misdemeanor charge. I mean, this is in contrast to the woman in Texas who received a 5-year sentence after falsifying her son's school district so he could go to a better school district. And yet Steve Bannon helps to undermine democracy and refuses to testify before Congress when he's issued a lawful subpoena, and he gets up to a year, and that's assuming that he's even sentenced to a year, which the court could certainly issue a sentence of less than that. The truth is, it kind of leaves a little bit of a stale taste in my mouth. And in particularly, I hate to say it, but it gives me a little bit of my frustration with the leadership of the Democratic Party some more justification. I mean, don't get me wrong. We need to fight for the Democrats and get them elected in the next election, vote blue no matter who, etc., etc., etc. But we should also push our leaders to do better. And in this case, I'm frustrated by the mealy-mouthed response not just of Merrick Garland, but of the leadership in Congress as well. After all, the only response to contempt of Congress is not simply to send it over to the Justice Department and hope they prosecute, which sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Congress itself has inherent contempt powers. Now, granted, it has been a long time since one of the chambers of Congress has sent the sergeant-at-arms to arrest somebody for not complying with a lawful order from Congress, but they can do that. They also could have brought a civil suit, whereby they essentially ask a judge to either jail or fine someone until they comply with a lawful subpoena. After all, subpoena, when you break it down, it means under threat of penalty. And yet the penalty, again, it doesn't seem very compelling. Let me give you an example of where contempt is enforced appropriately. And that was done in New York by a judge there, Arthur Engeron to be specific, against Donald Trump when Donald Trump refused to comply with a subpoena from Attorney General Letitia James. That judge issued an order saying that Trump would have to pay $10,000 a day in fines until he complied. You see, that's how contempt is supposed to work, where literally, until the individual complies with the order, they either sit in jail or pay a fine. And Congress simply could have imposed those type of penalties upon the people who are refusing to comply with their subpoenas. Instead, they took the mealy-mouthed approach of essentially washing their hands of it and sending them off to the Justice Department, hoping that the Justice Department would do something with them, which in some cases they have, in some cases they haven't. What's more is that Bannon is going to go to jail, but when he gets out, he can refuse to comply with another subpoena from Congress. There's no ongoing penalty if he refuses to comply. As a result of that, I'd sure like to see Congress use its inherent power to enforce contempt of Congress just a little bit more. This would finally be an example of the Democrats maybe getting a little bit more aggressive and actually showing some of the fight that so many of us have been calling for them to demonstrate a lot more of in defense of our nation's democracy. Well, if you want to find out about someone who actually is trying to hold Donald Trump accountable, check out this video I did a little bit while ago about the Georgia prosecutor who's going after Donald Trump for undermining the election. That prosecution seems to be moving forward pretty aggressively. I'll see you then. In the meantime, let's hope for continued progress. Thank you.